All right, students. Section 3 is not really long, but I think I'm still going to break it down into two pieces. So this section is about Jackson and the National Bank. As you're going to see, they don't get along real well. Okay, so we can actually call it Jackson's War against the bank, and you will have to know the story of this for tests and just for general knowledge. A lot of people who settle in the West don't like the banks. If you remember from Texas history last year, Texas didn't like and made a rule when it first became a country that they didn't want any banks. They don't trust people who are bankers. And so Jackson had been born, I think, like in the Carolinas, but then raised in Tennessee. And he has this distrust against the bank. He thinks they're only for the wealthy and the powerful. And in a way, he's kind of right. He views it as a monopoly, which is something that is a monopoly on anything is when you have total control over it. And the wealthy are mainly comprised of educated individuals on the East Coast who could more easily obtain a loan. Okay, these people can more. Banks are for people who can get a loan. Those are for the East Coast people, the small business owners, the people who are shipping magnates, people like that. But farmers, poor farmers and small farmers are not going to be getting loans. And the banks don't want to make loans to these people, and they don't meet the policies of the banks. So naturally, people like Jackson have a huge distrust of banks. And the private bankers, to some extent, control the government supply of money. And they also control the elected officials to a certain extent, and I'll show you how here in a little bit. All right, so let's look at the election of 1832. Now, this is when Jackson is looking to be reelected, all right? Now, you don't have to remember Nicholas Biddle's name. I think if he's ever in a question, his name will be given to you. But understand that he's the president of the National Bank. Now, Henry Clay is still trying to get back at Jackson because Clay had wanted to be president. All right, so Biddle says to Clay, and Webster also, had wanted to be president. Let's use the bank to get back at Jackson in the upcoming presidential campaign. Okay, this is what we're going to do, guys. We'll all gang up and we'll use this whole issue of the bank and we'll take Jackson down with this. They persuade Biddle, okay, Biddle is the bank's president. He needs to ask for a new charter, and that's a government permit. Remember, I told you about this before. The bank has to have a government permit to run, all right? Now, the charter doesn't expire for a couple years yet, not till 4 more years, 1836, but they're going to apply for one now because they can make it an election issue for Jackson. They think this is going to hurt Jackson because they know that Jackson's going to veto this permit, this charter. He's going to veto it. All right, so Clay thinks that he's going to defeat Jackson and win the presidency if Jackson vetoes the charter because he assumes that all the people in the country will be on Clay's side and say, bank is good, Jackson is bad. Well, we'll see. Well, they were really, really wrong. Jackson vetoed the bill, and instead of losing support, the people loved Jackson for it. They reelected him as president based on 2 things. All right, he had the support of the people, and he argued that the bank was unconstitutional. I'm sorry that my little cartoon is outside the frame. He says the bank is unconstitutional. There was nothing in the Constitution that said anything about bank. Now, never mind that we have had Supreme Court decisions since then that says the bank is constitutional. Remember, we've had those Supreme Court decisions. That's called McCulloch versus Maryland. But let's remember, Jackson doesn't really care what the Supreme Court says about anything. And he can make this argument to the people. The people love him, and they'll listen to him. And so he says the Supreme Court said this is completely unconstitutional. Jackson persuades the people that he's right and Clay and Webster are wrong, and of course he wins re-election. And because the people love him. The people love him. It's just that simple. All right. A majority of citizens support Jackson's veto, but not everyone. And so some people start having a problem. There was an assassination attempt on Jackson, and the guns misfired. Davy Crockett was with the president at the time and ran the guy down and disarmed him. So Davy Crockett was a hero even before the Alamo. And Lawrence was mentally unstable without connections to Jackson's political rivals. But Jackson was convinced that Lawrence was put to it by Clay and Webster. It's also the first ever assassination attempt on a president. All right, so let's talk about the death of the bank. Again, I'm sorry my little cartoon is outside of the frame, because this political cartoon up here, what you can see of it, you need to pay attention to it. It'll be on a test, and it is famous because all those heads up there on that snake, those are all the heads of all the banks that he's trying to chop off the heads of the snake. Okay, that's what that represents. All right, so with his reelection, Jackson decides to kill the bank, make it really dead before its charter even expires. He's like, no, I'm not only not going to veto, I'm going to veto this thing so it dies in 4 years, but I'm getting rid of it now. He orders all of the government money to be withdrawn and placed in smaller state banks. He trusts the states, but not this big national bank. And finally, he refuses to sign the new charter for the bank in 1836, so it's forced to close. He does distrust the bank, but somehow this isn't going to go well. And then we're going to have a new president, Martin Van Buren. I'm going to go through this slide, but then I'm going to stop here. So Jackson decides not to run for a third presidential term, just like most of the other presidents. And he was getting up in years too. And he had taken the death of his wife so hard. It was hard for him to go on without her. And the Democrats choose Martin Van Buren, who is Jackson's vice president. They want more Jackson, like I told you. They want more of the same, and this never really works out. So they want Martin Van Buren. They think there's going to be more Jackson, but he's really not. Okay. The Whigs start a new party. This is a brand new party called the Whigs. You write that down. It's the former National Republicans, and there are other anti-Jackson people, and they nominate 3 candidates. Okay. You don't really need to pay attention to it because Van Buren wins, all right, because they think he's going to be more Jackson. Because he wins both the popular vote and the electoral vote count, and he becomes the 8th president, mostly because people want more Jackson. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and then we'll pick up here. And I may kind of review this a little bit when I start my next screencast.